This is a Tokugawa Ieyasu review. Tokugawa is the newest garrison commander in Rise of Kingdoms, so it goes without saying that we need to cover him in a review. So today's video, we're going to be covering his skills, talent selection, pairing options, and where I think he's going to fit in the meta overall. Without further ado, let's get started. First, let's talk about the skills. Tokugawa's first skill is a single target 2400 damage factor that reduces the target's defense by 10%. In addition, you get a 600 damage factor shield. So this is great 1v1, and it has a good damage factor, and the fact that it's smite damage is also beneficial. The shield is pretty solid, and the defense reduction is nothing to be too upset with, but it's not super flashy on its own. The second skill is a 30% bonus to attack when you have a basic attack or counterattack on a 25% chance. In addition, you get 10% march speed and 10% defense. This is, of course, less applicable to garrisons for the march speed, but 30% attack, 10% defense is decent. I would have loved to have seen health or damage reduction here, but overall, it's not anything that you can really say is horrible. The third skill is when you're a garrison, you deal a flat 10% bonus to damage. And whenever you deal smite damage, you get a 25% chance to cleanse a debuff and then gain a stack of 5% health. So this could stack up to a total of 20%, which is pretty good. I would have liked the stacks to be a little more value or to go a little higher. But 20% health is definitely solid when it comes to reducing damage taken, so it's not anything too crazily bad. In addition, it's worth mentioning that when you have true damage, which is going to be the archer counter to this eventually, that health is a great way to counteract this because true damage ignores defense, it does not ignore health. So it's pretty solid, but it's not anything that's super anti-swarm. The fourth skill is whenever you receive a buff, you have a 50% chance to gain another shield once every 7 seconds. A 1200 damage factor shield is pretty solid, so it's not anything to be too upset about, but a 50% chance whenever you receive a buff is a little bit interesting. Granted, it does play off of the garrison dealing smite damage. It also has a chance here with the attack bonus. So you have two different skills that can activate. So that's something that's super beneficial as well. So keep that in mind. And lastly, the expertise gives you a bonus whenever you launch a basic attack or counterattack. You have a 15 or 30% chance to deal smite damage in a fan. So 300 damage factor isn't anything too crazy. If you are getting swarmed and you're hitting a single march, it's going to take a nice little chunk. But it's almost like the old school Amani skill, in my opinion, where it's just not extremely great. So there's a little bit of concern here, mostly in his survivability against Swarm because the Swarm meta is so prevalent. But luckily, he's on the troop type that does the best against Swarm, so it's something we'll cover in the future. But overall, it's decent, but not anything that's totally game-breaking. Next, we are on to talents. Tokugawa has Infantry, Garrison, Smite. So this is a unique combination that doesn't really exist, but we're going to cover how you can invest in each different way. So first we're going to go to the nearest equivalent, which is Gorgo. Gorgo has Infantry, Garrison, and Defense, which is a little bit worse. But overall, you should absolutely invest in these yellow talents. The 13 points you put in here are musts for every Garrison commander. So if you're using him in Garrison, this is an absolute must. The next thing to consider is your red tree. You have two options. You can either go 31 talent points here and 30 into the blue tree, or you can go with less talent points here and more into the blue tree. First, I'll cover with the red tree. Hold the line is a must, so you want to have at least all those, where Defense Infantry, Strong of Body, Undying Fury, Iron Spear, and the talent that leads to it are all optional. All these together can give you an additional 12, so you can either go 31 and 30, or you can go 19 and 42. Since the Smite tree is so full of great options, the full tree is 48 talents. The tree with to the bitter end is 45, but to go to the max and get this completed is 42. So my recommendation is to do 42 here, do 19 talent points to hold the line here, and max it out, and then do the standard garrison talents. But overall, you could also switch it to be more in the infantry tree if you want to have more health, but it's just only going to be more beneficial if you aren't using a Hera or a good mixed defense that is not Smite. Because if you're using a Smite damage commander, you're just best off filling up the Smite tree. Next, we're on to formations, and like Scipio Milianus, it's pretty cut and dry. You can go with pincer formation, which is more Smite damage. This is the formation you should use when you're pairing him with another Smite damage commander, so most namely Gorgo. But alternatively, you can go with arch formation to have a little bit more swarm resistance since it boosts all normal damage. But realistically, those are the only two main ones. Pincer formation is the better one for overall damage output in 1v1, which Tokugawa seems to be his main focus is 1v1 damage. So that's the one you're going to probably use most often. For inscriptions, you basically want to prioritize your specialties, and then the blue lower versions of the specialties. Then prioritize damage reduction, especially with Tokugawa because he's a little bit fragile. And then damage output, then health, defense, and attack in that order. If you can get a bunch of damage reduction or a bunch of damage dealt on the inscriptions and the unit stats, absolutely go for that because it'll help keep them alive longer. But otherwise, just follow that priority to the best of your ability. Next, we are on to pairings. So there's some things to consider with Tokugawa. First, he has high damage output, but not so great survivability. Second, he is primarily smite damage. And third, he does have a little bit of bonus to the field, but it's mostly oriented around garrisons. So first we're going to talk about garrisons, and the most obvious choice is Gorgo. If you run Tokugawa and Gorgo, you run Tokugawa primary because he has the better talents, and you want to run that defense as only infantry, because Hold the Line's main buff is a bonus to take 20% less damage if you have only infantry. It is completely worth it, and if you can keep that defense entirely infantry, it's huge for Gorgo, it is huge for Tokugawa, and it's something that's going to pay dividends if you can manage it. Alternatively, if you're looking for a little more varied mixed defense, I would recommend Hera. I think Hera is probably better with Gorgo overall, because it's much tankier against Swarm, and Swarm is just so popular in the meta right now. But you can also use Tokugawa with Hera as well, and get a similar bonus where you have better resist against Swarm like you do with Gorgo. But overall, it tends to be a little weaker because you have conflicting damage sources, and because you have just a lot of missed opportunity versus what you get with Gorgo. For the field, you could consider Liu Che, or you could consider William Wallace or Scipio Milianus, but I really don't think he's going to pan out for field as much because he doesn't have a lot of great survivability that isn't tied to being garrison. So overall, I recommend Gorgo first if you can manage it, with Tokugawa as the primary commander in that pairing, and then Hera secondarily if you don't have that as an option. Last but certainly not least, we are on to meta fits. And this is a little bit tougher than some of the other options. He does have good potential. He does look like he's going to sync up well with Gorgo. He does look like he'll sync up okay with Hera. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to be a day one must max for every player. On the spectrum of garrisons, you have 1v1 heavy commanders, and you have swarm resistance commanders, and you have the middle ground. Gorgo is in the middle ground, maybe a little heavier on the swarm resist, but Tokugawa seems to be fully into the 1v1. And from what we've seen with other commanders in the past, whether you're talking about Lapu, whether you're talking about Eleanor, is that if you spec for more 1v1, it tends to hurt you a little more in the current meta because Swarm is so prevalent. So on his own, I don't think he'll shine as much as Gorgo, but I do think there's great potential because he can be an all infantry defense with Gorgo. Of course, this is going to take a lot of testing to really confirm, and this is very speculative at this point. But I do think there is a niche for him, and whether or not that is in the perfect center of the Garrison meta or a little off to the side as a 1v1 option, almost like a pass defense, like Eleanor is, for example, remains to be seen. But with that, we will wrap up our discussion on Tokugawa. This is definitely going to require a lot of testing and a lot of theory before we can definitively say where he's going to fit, because honestly, 1v1 damage commanders with single targets can be very hit or miss when it comes to garrisons, just due to how crazy the swarm meta is. But let me know what you think. Are you thinking he's going to be the next slam dunk? Or are you a little more cautious like I am? Let me know down in the comments. If you want to see me cover another commander or another topic altogether, let me know down in the comments as well, or join the Discord using the link in the description. And as always, good luck, fight well, and I will see you on the battlefield.